The Choices and Challenges Forum series was developed at Virginia Tech to explore the ethical and social dimensions of science and technology. The following presentation, taken from one of the forums in the Choices and Challenges series, is made possible by a grant from the Center for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Additional support has been provided by Video Broadcast Services and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Virginia Tech.
Technology, which is, I guess, the theme here, is about designs. According to my friend David Perkins, when we want to understand a design, we have to know its purpose or its goal, its structure, and the arguments about why the structure serves that purpose. Consider, for example, an advanced design, a type of word processor. Its structure is that of a hexagonal prism made of soft wood, with a graphite core and a piece of soft rubber attached to one end. The arguments show how each part of the structure serves some purpose. The graphite rubs off on paper. The wood holds the graphite. It's soft. The wood is soft so that it can be stripped off easily as the graphite is used. And it's hexagonal so it doesn't roll off the table. Designs come in families. Pencils are related to pens, chalk, magic markers, and more distantly to computers. Members of this family differ in that they serve different purposes as well as common purposes. For example, a pencil, for example, supports such features as variable type sizes, character sets from all alphabets, and user-friendly mixing of text and graphics. Today I want to put on design-colored graphics, design-colored glasses, and look at the last 100 years of intelligence tests and the theories behind them. I think we'll see a family of designs. If we bear in mind the fact that different members of the family serve different purposes, we shall be in a better position to avoid certain mistakes, like using a pencil to write on a blackboard. I will conclude this talk by proposing a new member of the family, or a somewhat new member, a concept of intelligence as a set of standards for the conduct of our thinking. My main point is that intelligence tests and the theories of intelligence behind them are best understood in terms of their purposes. First, a warning. I will neglect many counter-arguments against what I say. I have tried to follow my own theory of good thinking and to take these counter-arguments into account. I'll ask you to bear in mind that when there's a counter-argument, there's often a counter-counter-argument, and I won't make those either. In the 1860s and 70s, Francis Galton developed a concept of intelligence as individual differences in basic mental abilities. He developed the first tests of such abilities, and these were things like squeezing a dynamometer to measure grip strength, tests of sensitivity to pain. He had the idea that more intelligent people were more sensitive to pain. One purpose of Galton's theory was the idea of eugenics. So we can talk about a eugenic design, or controlled selection of superior beings. The structure of this design was the use of a good intelligence test to pick out people who ought to be encouraged to reproduce, for example, by giving them prizes for large families. In a few generations, the intelligence of the species, or at least the nation where this was done, would increase to everyone's benefit. Galton didn't complete the arguments for the eugenic design, but he had many followers, particularly Carl Pearson and Charles Spearman, who did. The first argument for the eugenics design is that intelligence tests measure something real and useful, that they correlate with the worldly manifestations of intelligence. That is, people who do well on the tests tend to do well in real life, and people who do poorly on the tests do poorly in real life. In a paper published in 1904, Charles Spearman actually found substantial correlations between Galton-type tests, tests of perceptual ability and speed of reaction time, on the one hand, and teachers' ratings of children's intelligence, on the other hand. This supports that argument. Subsequent research on IQ tests has also supported Spearman's original conclusion. For example, criminals tend to have low IQs, and not just those who get caught. As for the question, if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? IQ does correlate a bit with income, even among people with similar education. On the other hand, I don't think we can regard this argument as settled once and for all. Correlations between IQ tests and success are highest when the measures of success have something to do with schoolwork, with what one learns in school, or with the effects on success of school. When we look at other kinds of activities, we sometimes find that IQ does not predict success. For example, a very recent study of C.C. and Leiker involved a group of men who had bet on harness racing, as they put it, almost every day of their adult lives, except for the occasional weddings of daughters and funerals of close relatives. C.C. and Leiker measured the ability of these men to predict the odds on a horse. This is not a trivial skill. Interviews with the subjects as they studied the racing form revealed thinking on the order of complexity of that shown by chess players. The skill also pays off in real money. The IQ of these men ranged from very high to nearly retarded. Yet, the correlation between IQ and ability to predict the odds was essentially zero. There was no relation at all. This sort of finding, and others like it, suggests that we should be wary about the success of our current tests in predicting intelligence, in predicting success. In fact, IQ tests are quite limited in the kinds of abilities they sample, so in many ways this result shouldn't be all that surprising. No items on the IQ tests I know require sustained work on a single project, over days, for example, the sort of work done by artists and scientists. No items require the exercise of reflective judgment of the sort involved in administrative decisions. No items require the learning of limited systems, such as chess, harness racing, or the operation of a factory. IQ tests emphasize mental glibness and broad but superficial knowledge. For better or worse, these characteristics are important in our schools and in many of our workplaces, so they might be worth encouraging, but they are only some of the intellectual traits that matter. And they don't seem to fully determine the other ones either, though there's probably some effect. The second argument so the first argument I would put sort of mostly true, but there's some question marks. The second argument is that the abilities measured by the tests are inherited, and that the success that results from those abilities is inherited as well. Galton made this argument through an extensive study showing that eminence ran in families, like his, for example. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton also suggested that inheritance could be established by studying twins. He didn't do much of that himself, or any, to my knowledge, but it's been done a lot since his time, and the studies done since his time have generally supported the view that what the tests measure is substantially inherited. Recent studies of twins have found that, for example, genetically identical twins that have the same genetic material correlate very highly. And when they're raised in the same family, the correlation, often there's no difference at all in IQ. When they're separated at birth or soon after birth, there's still a very high correlation among the IQs of identical twins reared apart. So that's the kind of evidence that supports this second argument. As for the inheritance of success itself, there seems to be some genetic component there too. The same kinds of studies indicate that success is also somewhat genetically determined, although not as much as the test scores. I don't know of any studies of the genetics of successful betting on harness racing. A third argument is that eugenics can work in practice. There's serious doubt about this now. There have been many abuses and errors in the attempts to apply genetic principles. Just to take one example, eugenic arguments were made in the United States Congress. Whether the congressman listened to them, I don't know. When the immigration law of 1928 was passed, this law was designed to keep out the so-called races that tended to receive lower test scores, such as Eastern Europeans and Jews. This law was in effect when many of these very people were trying to flee the Nazis a few years later and get into the U.S. Still, a time may come when we'll be able to handle eugenics as a policy consideration and when we are more certain of our tests. Because of this, I think that the eugenic design provides a legitimate justification for continued basic research on the genetics of mental abilities. A second design, which I shall call the medical design, is closely related to the eugenic design. It's become clear that intellectual functioning is affected not only by genetics but also by other biological influences, such as childhood and fetal malnutrition, drugs of all sorts, including those taken by pregnant mothers, alcohol, again, mostly in pregnant mothers, environmental pollutants such as lead, but probably not only lead, and degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and maybe even normal aging, and maybe even things like exercise. In the study of such effects, we need a measure of that component of intelligence that's affected by current brain functioning. So the idea here is to use IQ tests. My time's up? No. Use IQ tests like medical tests. We need okay, IQ tests have been used for this purpose, but they're not ideal. And again, for example, many IQ tests contain measures of vocabulary and general knowledge, which are often preserved, even in cases of fairly serious brain degeneration. I suspect that the more useful tests for this purpose are going to be the sort of things that people like Arthur Jensen are now exploring. The use of reaction time measures to measure basic mental functions such as speed and accuracy of simple judgments and decisions, working memory capacity, things like that. These measures are already useful in the medical design, even if they're not useful elsewhere, and they may be useful elsewhere. A battery of such tests is probably needed because it's already clear that certain biological manipulations affect some of these measures but not others, even though the others may be affected by something else. Just to take one example, Valium seems to affect our ability to learn, but not our ability to recall what we have already learned. So it's okay to take Valium during an exam, but not while you're studying for it. But that was found out by using a very nice little experimental design that separated learning and recall. The medical design uses intelligence tests as analogous to tests of cardiovascular health, such as blood pressure and electrocardiograms. Perhaps when some country has real money to spend on psychological research once again, we'll see the mental equivalent of the Framingham study of heart disease. Just what are the risk factors for poor mental functioning? What do these risk factors have to do with the consequences of such functioning, such as criminal behavior? In sum, the medical design is one where we are now able to use tests with considerable success. I really think this is something we know how to do, as long as we make sure not to use a pencil to write on a blackboard. A third design I want to talk about, arose in connection with the institution of compulsory schooling in France in the late 19th century. Many children were failing in the regular schools, apparently for a variety of reasons. The psychologist Alfred Binet, who had studied intelligence before but never from the point of view of testing it, developed the first modern intelligence test around 1905 in connection with his work on a panel that was appointed to study the problem of school failure. The structure of Binet's design was to use a test to select children who could not keep up in the regular classroom, but who might be able to benefit from some other sort of instruction, what we now call special education. Binet had earlier convinced himself that intelligence cannot be fully understood in terms of simple mental processes, such as discrimination and association or reaction time. In making up his test, he largely ignored the measures made up by Galton, Spearman, others, such as measures of perceptual ability, grip strength, or speed of simple reactions. Instead, Binet used a variety of questions that seemed to him to require something he called judgment, or higher order judgment, such as comparing the meanings of words, filling in missing words from a story, doing simple analogies, interpreting pictures and proverbs. Sorts of things, the descendants of those are out in the hall. Binet had no powerful theory that led to his choice of items. His main criteria were that the items should require what he called judgment, which he never really defined, that they should not be taught directly in school, and that they should be sensitive to age in children. He assumed that children got smarter as they got older. In addition, he had to be sure that the items were easily scored as correct or incorrect, and that each item took a short time. These properties, such as easy scoring and short time, are characteristic of many school tasks, but they're not characteristic of many expressions of intellect in real life. Subsequent test developers have largely accepted Binet's criteria. So what we call an appropriate IQ test item is derived historically from Binet's items, but so far as I can see, there's no other theory that dictates that we should use those kinds of items rather than any of the others that I mentioned earlier. Subsequent test developers, more recent tests use items that are less dependent on particular cultural experience, or that are supposed to be anyway, and more appropriate in difficulty for the people they're given to. But it was Binet who set the pattern for intelligence testing up to now. So I've been using the word IQ test to refer to Binet-type tests, even though Binet himself didn't like the idea of assigning a number to the results of his test. He wanted it to be a sort of more clinical test. And even though the term IQ was invented by Stern and Terman some years after Binet. The selection design was remarkably successful. The IQ test did and still does succeed in picking out those children who were having trouble in the regular classroom. Of course, Spearman's perceptual tests did this too, but somehow that was forgotten. Perhaps because Spearman himself wasn't concerned with this purpose. Subsequent studies have also found that the IQ test is almost the only test that's useful for educational tracking. There are other kinds of information, like teachers' judgments. Children who do poorly on a test actually learn more effectively or efficiently in a class that moves more deliberately, leaving nothing to be assumed, than they do in a regular classroom. Children who do very well on the test learn more efficiently than they do they learn more efficiently from a type of class that moves quickly, letting the student fill in the gaps than the same students do in a normal classroom. Thus, use of the IQ tests for educational tracking, along with other information, benefits all students who are singled out for special education, or most students, whether that special education is slower or faster than the regular classroom. The use of IQ tests for more able students, by the way, wasn't part of Binet's original design. He was kind of skeptical about whether it could be used for that. But it was a member of a subfamily of designs that Binet spawned. The particular modification was made by the American psychologist Louis Terman, who essentially invented the idea that giftedness was something you can measure with a test, as opposed to the number of compositions, number of symphonies written by age 10, and things like that. In sum, the best argument for the selection design is that it works. IQ tests are helpful in selecting children who do better in special classes than in regular ones. Of course, errors will be made, but in deciding to use an IQ test for selection, we have to compare it to the alternatives. In general, fewer errors will be made with the test than without the test. In Binet's view, special education was not merely slower than the regular classroom, but also remedial. Binet developed exercises to improve intelligence. For example, one of his exercises had children holding a frozen position, like a statue, for as long as possible. This was supposed to develop concentration. Binet's remediation design was not picked up by those who called themselves his followers, people like Terman. But the idea wasn't completely lost. The purpose here is to increase intelligence, to remedy the deficiency of low intelligence, or maybe just increase intelligence in general. The structure is a little confused, I think, but it's to use the test as a measure of the need for remediation and of the success of remediation once it's achieved, or once it's attempted. So in addition, the structure has to provide a theory of what is to be remedied and how the remediation is to be carried out. We can't simply teach students to do the test. This is like trying to warm your house by holding a match under the thermostat. One argument for this design is that intelligence is... One argument for this design is that intelligence is affected by experiential factors, as well as biological ones. It's clear, and this seems to be pretty much true. It's clear that families and schools do things to their children that affect even their IQs, their school performance, and certainly their success in life, aside from giving them their genetic material. In less developed countries, where a large proportion of children don't go to school, performance on Binet-type items or other kinds of cognitive tasks increases with years of schooling, but it does not increase much with age in children who don't attend school. So it seems to be schooling that's causing the increase with age in many of these items. This effect of schooling is found even when the tasks are carefully designed so as to use material that's equally familiar to all children in the society, like cards based on children's games, for example. A second argument has been, for this remediation design, has been that some manifestations of intelligence can be affected by conscious educational efforts. In the 1960s, many American psychologists argued that intelligence could be taught just like anything else, and these arguments inspired several experimental preschool programs where kids were put in special schools for a year or two before school. It's now clear that these programs didn't live up to the expectations that were held for them. Most of the programs had lasting effects on such aspects of school performance as placement in special classes or retention and grade, but they didn't have any lasting effects on IQ or even grades insofar as they could be measured. And that was surprising to the people who designed them. On the other hand, the most intensive of these programs did have short-term effects on IQ. Similar programs with older children have also had short-term effects on IQ, and most of them, those haven't been followed up for much longer. For example, a few years ago, the government of Venezuela initiated several projects to increase intelligence. One of these was a course designed for 8th graders by Bolt, Beranek, and Newman in Cambridge. And it had a short-term and fairly substantial effect on IQ scores. As yet, no long-term evaluation has been reported on that study. I'll mention some other programs like these later. Thus, our efforts to increase intelligence seem to be characterized by great hopes but questionable success. What conclusion should we draw about the remediation design? I think we shouldn't yet dismiss it. First, we may need lasting changes in children's environments rather than just 1 or 2 year special programs. By analogy, we believe that nutrition affects health, but we don't expect a year of abstinence from junk food to decrease the probability of a heart attack 20 years later. Likewise, we believe that education in school subjects is effective. A lot of us probably here are teachers of one sort or another, and we think what we're doing matters. Yet I find this hard to believe. I find it hard to believe, for example, that my present meager knowledge of European history has very much at all to do with a 1-year course in it that I took in high school. I even passed it. If we take the remediation design seriously, I think we have to be willing to take short-term results and short-lasting results as encouraging. And we have to be willing to try to institute changes throughout the educational system, not just 1-year injections. A second response to the weak evidence for remediation effects is that so far remedial efforts have been based on false theories of how to increase intelligence and what it is that can be increased. One theory is that intelligence consists of the total of everything we know. Well, if we like, we can define intelligence this way, but this definition isn't useful for remediation. It doesn't lead to any distinction between raising intelligence and teaching anything else. If intelligence does consist of knowledge, it's got to be some special kind of knowledge. A second false theory is that capacities, such as mental speed or memory capacity, can be improved through practice. The evidence speaks unequivocally against this. Practicing analogy problems, for example, makes us faster at analogy problems, nothing else. Matching squares, having little preschoolers match squares and triangles probably makes them better at matching squares and triangles, but it doesn't help them learn to read or do anything else. Practice of this sort simply does not transfer. The literature is, to my knowledge, absolutely unequivocal. A third false theory about remediation is that whatever intelligence is, it develops naturally through interaction with the environment. A lot of remedial programs have been based on this idea, and on the other ideas too, I think. It's an idea that's bound to fail if our purpose is remediation. Even the dullest kindergarten child has been interacting with the environment for several years. More of the same is not likely to help him or her. When we attempt to increase intelligence, we need a better theory. I think that when we get a better theory, well, for one thing, we can't expect IQ tests to give us the theory. The IQ tests were made up because they worked. Binet had this intuitive idea, but he didn't have a really good theory about why these things should work or what he should try to increase. So we can't, the purpose of intelligence tests was not to tell us how to increase intelligence. I think that when we get a better theory, we'll have a different design, and I call it the standards design. And it has a lot less to do with testing as such. When we want to use a test to measure the success of an educational program, a Binet-type test may not do. The arguments for its utility are related to the selection design. As long as the issue is one of pure prediction of success in this or that program, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If we can predict success in school by measuring the ability to jump through hoops, we ought to do this, even if we have no understanding of why hoop jumping matters. However, when we use a test to measure the effect of instruction, it seems to me we have to tailor the test to what we want to teach. And when we teach intelligence, we need to know what we want to teach and why we want to teach it. We have to ask ourselves about the purpose of intelligence itself as a design, as something we invent to teach to children and to ourselves. I would argue that intelligence is, roughly, that set of abilities that improve the chances of success in the pursuit of any rational goal. Each such ability in this set should be subject to definition in any domain in which rational people strive for success. Some of the abilities that constitute intelligence are determined by the state of the brain, but others may be learned. It's the learned ones that we have to focus on when we speak of intelligence as a standard for education. We may thus speak of a standards design in which the purpose is to tell us what to teach. This, in turn, ought to help us find ways to teach it and measure the success of such teaching. The structure here, then, is a theory of teachable intelligence. In an effort to provide such a theory, I've argued that these standards should concern the conduct of thinking. By thinking, I mean a conscious response to doubt. Thinking is what we do when we're at a loss, at least for a moment, about what to do or what to believe. For example, my car just broke down, and it seems I need a new one. What should I do? That's something that occasions thinking. We may analyze all thinking into search and inference. We search for possibilities, evidence, and goals. Possibilities are possible answers to the question that inspired thinking. A new Toyota, an American car, or using the train in my wife's car. I may think of possibilities myself, or people may suggest them to me. Evidence is anything I use to decide among the possibilities. Statistics from consumer reports, information about nearby dealers, prices, and the time remaining until the next train strike. Goals are the criteria that I use to weigh the evidence. How much do I care about money versus convenience? Do I care at all about the welfare of Detroit auto workers as opposed to Tokyo auto workers? Goals are not all given. I have to search for them and sometimes discover them, just in the way that I have to search for evidence. The use of evidence in the light of the goals is to strengthen or weaken the possibilities, is what I call inference. You put it all together and each possibility gets stronger or weaker. Inference then is only part of thinking, and the rest is search. Thinking goes wrong for two reasons. First, our search misses something that it should have discovered, or we don't search enough. I may neglect to consider evidence concerning the cost of insurance. My goal of avoiding accidents, I can neglect to consider that my goal of avoiding accidents, or the possibility of taking the train. So I could fail to search for any one of these things. We make inference, the second problem, the second way that thinking goes wrong is that we make inferences in ways that are unfair to some of the possibilities. I may ignore evidence when it goes against a possibility I initially favor. If I have it in my head to buy a new Toyota, I may suppress reasons for doing otherwise. The same favoritism for an initial possibility may cause me to cut off my search prematurely for alternatives to my first idea or for reasons why it might be wrong. Unintelligent thinking is usually characterized by too little search and, more importantly, I think, by biases in favor of possibilities that we favor initially. By contrast, intelligent thinking consists of search that is thorough in proportion to the importance of the question. And it also is fair to other possibilities aside from the one we favor to start out. I think these two principles, optimal search and fairness, are also the ones we apply when we criticize each other in academic or school settings. They're the standards we actually use, pretty much. When I read a student's paper or a colleague's, or sometimes even my own, the things I look for are omissions of relevant evidence, omissions of statements about goals or purposes, and omissions of alternative possibilities, other answers to the question at hand. I also look for partiality to the thesis of the paper, partiality that may itself cause the omissions. When students take these kinds of criticisms to heart and try to become more thorough, more impartial, more self-critical, I think they're becoming more intelligent thinkers. They're acquiring abilities in the form of habits and values that will increase their effectiveness just as surely as would an improvement in their memory or their mental speed. People who follow these standards would be those who seek the truth, not those who feel their first intellectual obligation is to defend a certain belief, to make it true despite the evidence. They would be those who try to make the best decisions for themselves and others, not those who want to say, "I told you so." They will be people who want to be right, not those who want to have been right. I don't see why we would want to withhold the term intelligent from such people, even if they have trouble solving certain kinds of puzzles or if their vocabulary is small. What they have may be more valuable for all the things we want intelligence for than what the stubborn bigot has, even when he or she scores 160 on the IQ test. Of course, I might not have it quite right. If I follow my own theory, I should be open to criticisms of the framework I've sketched. The important point I want to make is that this kind of theory is an example of another kind of design, the concept of intelligence as a standard, a goal of education. IQ tests are not appropriate for measuring the success of educational efforts based on this design. It now appears that Binet was wrong to think that the abilities they measure are those that are easily changed or those that have much to do with the kinds of standards we can hope to enforce. Many of the items, such as vocabulary, are sensitive to learning that occurs only over many years. Good thinking might eventually help a person to acquire a large vocabulary, but only over many years of thinking about the words one runs across. Other IQ items are apparently more sensitive to biologically determined capacities, such as speed of basic mental operations. If we adopt the standards design, what sort of tests will we have? How do we find out how well we are doing at teaching people to think intelligently? One way is to do what we're already doing, but more explicitly. For example, in an English class, we could require students to write essays and then grade them on their thoroughness in making possibilities, evidence, and goals explicit, and on their fairness in weighing the evidence. We can make these standards clear to students from the outset. In the workplace, we could judge people by the same standards rather than on their luck in being associated with projects that happen to succeed. We might even apply these standards to politicians. The standards design isn't entirely my own. In 1934, Otto Seltz published an important paper that said in muddy German prose what I've just tried to say in hopefully less muddy English. John Dewey has to also be counted as an advocate of this design. The standards design, as I've described it, may lead to more effective programs to improve intelligence through education. Programs may be more effective when we have a clear idea of what we're trying to do and when we don't try to do the impossible. There are already some encouraging results. Seltz himself reported some small-scale experiments. Marion Blank designed a tutorial preschool program that was a direct inspiration for my own proposals. Again, her emphasis was on self-criticism and reflection, even on such matters as what would happen to a blackboard when we rub it with a wet sponge. Irene Gaskins and I developed a program with similar goals for children in a school for poor readers. There are many other approaches with similar goals, such as Matthew Lipman's Philosophy for Children program. These programs have been evaluated only in the short term, to my knowledge, but they do seem to improve academic performance. Black Blank's program even improved IQ scores, even though she points out herself that the IQ test ought to be a poor measure of what the program tried to teach. I think a worthwhile experiment would be to sustain approaches like this all the way through school. Let me summarize. I've argued that there are several different but related concepts of intelligence, each with its own purpose and each with its own history. The eugenics design has as its goal the measurement of inherited characteristics of mental performance that would be desirable for people to have more of. The medical design is concerned with the same sort of mental characteristics, but they need not be inherited. The purpose of the medical design is to find abilities that are affected by biological variables, such as drugs and disease. More sensitive measures of these effects could help us measure the success of medical treatments and the seriousness of risk factors. The Binet selection design has as its primary goal the selection of children for special education. Binet's original purpose was to select those students who were particularly slow, but the same idea seems to work for those who are fast. Binet's test does well for this purpose, although it may be possible that there's an even better test. Binet's other design was the remediation of intellectual deficiencies. In retrospect, his ideas about how to do this were probably off the track. Moreover, his test doesn't seem to be well suited for measuring the effects of training programs or for guiding them. I've suggested that the development of a test for this purpose must depend on the standards of the program in question. I've proposed that such standards should concern primarily the conduct of thinking. Intelligent thinkers are those who are sufficiently thorough in searching for possibilities, evidence, and goals, and those who are sufficiently critical of the possibilities they initially favor. The enforcement of such standards in school, in the family, in the workplace, and in our public lives would improve our effectiveness at achieving our rational goals. When this happens, I would like to call it an increase in intelligence. But that's not so important as just giving it a try, no matter what we call it.